I was talking to a friend of mine the other day about a mutual colleague. I was having difficulty working with this person, and I said to my friend, I said, some days I don't think we're even on the same planet. He laughed. He said, well, Jake, he said, there are some people for whom the glass is half full, and there are some people for whom the glass is half empty. And then there's Jack, whose glass is cracked and it's oozing out the bottom. I laughed. He was so on target. That was exactly it. And as I began to see Jack in that light, I began to understand him a little better, at least enough to be able to work with him and to recognize that we probably would never see things eye to eye. How we see the world, how we see that glass, has a lot to do with how we live, how we understand ourselves, the things that happen to us in life, our families, our friends, our colleagues, how we understand work, how we understand God. The gospel writers offer us different ways of seeing God through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Each one is a different perspective. Who is this Jesus? Is the question they all wrestle with. And what does it mean in my life? And what one discovers when one reads the Gospels is that what at times seems to be perfectly clear and self-evident about what and who Jesus is, those around him, those who should get it, the religious leaders and oftentimes the disciples, seem to be totally blind, totally in the dark, like Nicodemus. They just can't see. And one of the devices that the gospel writers use is to take a story of Jesus healing someone who is blind and using it to highlight this inability to see. And nowhere is that clearer than in the story in John's Gospel of the man born blind. A man comes to Jesus who is blind. Jesus makes mud and puts it in his eyes, tells him to go wash. The man washes, and he sees. Now, his friends and neighbors start speculating as to whether or not this man who now sees was really blind, or whether it really is the man. I mean, maybe he just looks like him. He goes to the religious leaders to be authenticated, to be reinserted into society because his blindness made him unclean. And they want to know how it is that he sees. And he says, well, this Jesus guy makes mud and puts on my eyes and told me to go wash. And I washed and now I see. And he said, well, when did he do it? He said, well, he did today. Well, today is the Sabbath. He shouldn't be doing work on the Sabbath. It's against the law. This man must be a sinner. He said, I don't know whether he's a sinner or not. All I know is that I couldn't see and now I see. And so the religious leaders drag his parents in. Is this your son? Yeah. Was he born blind? Yes. So how is it that he now sees? Well, they're not real sure they want to answer that question because other people have said things about Jesus and got thrown out of the synagogue. They're not in a hurry to be done. And so they said, ask my son. He's of age. He can tell you. He can speak for himself. And so they drag the man born blind back in and go through an interrogation. And he keeps giving the same answer. I don't know who this Jesus is. All I know is that I was blind and now I see. He says, you guys are awful interested in this Jesus. Do you want to become his followers? Well, with this, they get angry and they throw him out. And there Jesus meets him and introduces himself. And then Jesus ends the story with a rather cryptic saying, I've come into the world that those who cannot see now see, and that those who think they see are revealed to be blind. Now we all sit back rather self-satisfied, saying, well, yeah, the Pharisees, Sadducees, the disciples, they don't get it. But you have to remember that John's writing his gospel for us as the church. And so that word should sting a little. Because we too really struggle with seeing the world through the grace of God. It just doesn't make sense to us. It doesn't explain why things happen the way they do. And in the midst of chaos and craziness like we're living through, in the midst of those crises in our lives, illness, loss of jobs, loss of family, loss of life and loved ones, none of this makes sense. We don't understand a God who would let these things happen. We fail to see. We fail to understand. And so we either go to an understanding where there is no God, or God is just arbitrary, or malicious, or as the Old Norse in their Loki god was, capricious and manipulative, or we create God in our image and make God a God of sense, a God of the law, rights and wrongs, and this belief and that belief. It always strikes me as somewhat humorous that the more religious somebody is, the more I recognize their God in them, that they've created quite a convenient God. We struggle with this way of seeing the world because it doesn't make sense. A God who would wade into the muck and the mire of our daily existence to love us, care for us, to walk with us in the darkness. Why would God do that for us? Why does he keep showing up? That's why God puts us in community. Because alone we cannot see. At least not all the time. Sometimes we need people to open our eyes, to point out the obvious, that the glass is cracked and the liquid is running out the bottom. I took drawing lessons for about 10 years from a retired art professor at the university, Francis Baptist. He struggled a lot with me. I don't have a lot of drawing ability. I'm not sure how much technique I mastered in those 10 years. But what Francis really taught me was how to see differently, to begin to see the world through the eyes of an artist. And I would argue in many ways through the eyes of God. Because he taught me that those things that I saw as ugly or deformed or dark, things that I would tend to avoid or judge, had a unique beauty. That there was something about that that spoke in a way that what I considered beautiful never captured. A twist of a hand, a blemish, a broken piece. And I began to look at the world differently. We need those people around us that continue to open our eyes, that we may see. For we too have our blind spots. And even on occasion, our glasses are cracked and the liquid's pouring out. And on those days, God throws a splash of water on us and reminds us, you are mine. You always will be. Let's get going. Amen.